Hello everyone, today we talk about Roman military equipment. There is really not much military, strictly speaking about it, it's just about clothing. We talk about these things for the sake of complexion. We're talking about the Roman army, and more specifically the mantle and the headgear, essentially in the early imperial period, right? So we start from the Sagum, the Paenula, and the Paludamentum. Always bear in mind that before the late Roman Empire, I use essentially the pronunciatio restituta as far as we can know about the original Roman pronunciation that nobody recorded, so it's just an hypothesis, but at least that's how I think it is. Otherwise, I would have pronounced it Sagum, Paenula, and Paludamentum, right? That's the general standard I use in my videos. These are essentially all different types of mantles. So it's important to introduce also a concept here is that the Romans actually had ways of distinguishing the properly military clothing from the civilian one. And we know, of course, that the Roman soldiers, being quite proud of it, were other signs of distinction, but essentially some passed through the clothing proper. And there were much was associated to it in moral terms. Like, for example, cowardly soldiers were sometimes stripped of their clothes or dressed like women, right? And all these accused, of course, of scarce masculinity, for cowards, etc. So we know relatively a few. This is a moment in history in which essentially the Roman equipment was provided in good part by these private contractors for the state that was starting to organize also something more centralized, but also like it would happen definitely in the late Roman Empire, but a part of these clothes were actually also drawn from other sources, right? Sometimes even produced by the same legionnaires within their castra. And this is just for saying that you can expect all the heterogeneity of the case, especially in this moment in early imperial times where legions began to be stationed permanently along the frontiers, and they also kind of get influenced by the local customs, but simply by being isolated from one another, developing sometimes their own specific types of decorations and patterns and so on. But today we talk about this kind of standard types of mantles, and as we will see, also the headgears. And we start from the Sagum, right? It was the classical military mantle. It was actually also characteristic of the Republican period, but that was adopted diffusely also in the later centuries. So what is interesting about the Sagum is that was the symbol itself of the state of war, right? Differently from the toga, that was instead considered a clothing of peace, right? Because as long as the state of war remained, the sagum was worn normally also by the civilians in everyday life, or at least this is traditionally a thing. Hence, for example, certain Latin expressions by Cicero, for example, sagum sumere or ad saga ire, right? That this is stated, and this is quoted from the Philippicae, 531 in 14:1. That was synonymous for entering in the war, right? Just as sagum ponere meant to make peace, right? That is, if you go to war, you take the sagum, right? If peace is signed, you essentially repose your sagum. And this is a tradition that evidently being applied also to civilians stresses, of course, the ancient ideal of the warriorhood of every Roman freeman, right? So the idea that theoretically every Roman should have gone to war at that point, of course, at this point wasn't at all like this, if anything, because the army was on a voluntary basis. So Marcus, but we know that actually this custom went on, right? That there was some symbolism throughout all of this time being attached to this kind of clothing was used. Marcus Aurelius, for example, attempted to prohibit its use as the sign of anti-militarist policy, right? Albeit without success. So this is fascinating. This is from the Historia Augusta, Marcus Aurelius 27. It actually shows, Marcus Aurelius basically, rightfully considered philosopher, emperor, right? But also had, an empire of war, which he, from his Stoic ideals, also wasn't completely fond of, but had to wage them, and therefore in Rome, presumably, but I don't know actually if this quote specifies this, but I mean, people wore the Sagum by saying, "Oh, look, we are at war now." So this is fascinating because it also shows how this the Sagum was associated to a kind of an old-fashioned traditionalist mentality for which the Romans were actually happy, right, that there was war, and even if at this time this custom was, wearing the Sagum during wartime was, falling into use, but some, in order to criticize the imperial policy, would still wear it in this context. And the Sagum in itself was not very different from the Greek chlamys. Actually, it had usually a rectangular form, and the same term is, by the way, used for address other type of mantles, right? Including those multicolored ones worn by the Celts, by the Germans, and by the barbarians in general. We know this from Tacitus' Historia 2:20. So the Sagum was made up concretely by this coarse and heavy woolen fabric. We know it from Martialis 1459, that was fastened with a buckle known as fibula, right, on the right shoulder, thus leaving uncovered the right flank, right, in order to allow this wider freedom of movements, and especially the use of the sword. While the left part of the Sagum was usually kept folded over the shoulder, leaving this characteristic and wide drapery on the right side of the chest. This is easily seen in most of, in fact, Roman iconography displaying the Sagum, and the edge of the Sagum was usually provided with fringes, right? While usually the anterior strip was fastened with the fibula, so to leave this lighter drapery on the chest. And in imperial times, also another type of mantle began to be spread, right? The Paenula, right? That had actually Etruscan origins, as far as we can see. That these types of clothes are to be found in a way or another. We've seen the Sagum that actually seems to have had even a Semitic etymology, right? This is names and the concepts the Romans taken from the outside, right? Think about the Greek chlamys in this regard, and the evidence of Etruscan paenulae in the previous centuries. And in this mantle, the paenula was wider and provided with a characteristic hood. Also, the paenula was the typical mantle of the travelers and the wayfarers, right? In order to repair from cold and rain. We know this from also other passages, for example, Cicero pro Milone 20 and Ad Atticum 1333. These types of clothes, well, as we have seen, were widespread all over Europe, all over the Mediterranean. It wasn't really a Roman prerogative, but the Romans evidently had at least began to adopt this later type kind of later. Many say that this happened also because in early imperial times, essentially the Roman Empire takes more specifically continental European dimension in the northern frontier. So also because of the colder weather of the north, the Romans got the heavier in clothing. Really, yeah, I mean it's true in part. Always given that, of course, like that this clothes had actually always existed in Roman use. But they kind of become more iconic in some ways. Perhaps, in fact, also because of the aforementioned reason. So the Paenula covered the entire figure, right? The entire silhouette. And its form could be circular, semicircular, or elliptic. The hood, named cucullus, was formed by two rectangular pieces of cloth, and it was sewn around the edge of the neck, right? And the soldiers wore the paenula with the strips raised over the shoulders, right? So to maintain the sides, the flanks free, and to especially leave in good evidence the gladius and the pugio, right? As it appears in numerous reliefs, beautiful ones. Like, for example, there is the paenula worn by Caius Valerius Valens at the Archaeological Museum of Corinth, then the soldier of the relief of Chamomile Street, that also shows two different types of clothing of the paenula over the chest at the Museum of London. And the fact of leaving the sides uncovered was very important, because the cingulum militaris was like as the major, basically would evolve ever more during time as the symbol of military men in the first place. And as you understand, the swords and the pugio even more. And sometimes we actually think, as we've seen, that military clothing, yes, was somewhat specific in some occasions, but of course, since uniformity didn't quite exist, naturally still the weaponry was the most emblematic identification, mean of identification for military men in a context where naturally the Roman Empire had a substantial demilitarization, right? It was basically forbidden to use weapons of a certain size, especially out there. But naturally the military was sometimes actually also dealing with living among the other civilians, and that was an important sign of recognition. Consider in this regard, there is no uniform proper, right? Also the attempts of uniforming units with certain colors and certain patterns, which did exist, right? We can't talk about uniformation given an extremely low degree compared to what we're used to in that sense. But what really distinguished the military clothing was maybe naturally the typology, but also the way, for example, it was worn, right? Because a certain specific type of cloth was functional theoretically to different activities, to different lifestyles. So that is what really distinguished the military man from the civilian, aside from other elements, as we have seen. So the paenula was left usually with this wide space around the neck. We know it from Pliny, the Historia Naturalis, 24, 138. And this area was, as we will see now, often protected with a sort of scarf known as focale. And the paenula was generally made up of a heavy woolen fabric. Pliny, also in the Historia Naturalis 873, says that especially the fabric coming from Apulium was of excellent quality. However, the paenula could also be made of felt, right, such as the paenula gausapina, according to Martialis, 14145, or even of leather, right, in order to grant this greater impermeability. And in this case, it was called instead paenula scortea, which means in fact made of skin. This is also from Martialis 14130. The paenula was worn laced on the chest, not only with brooches or buckles, the fibulae, but also with other systems of other clothing systems such as tassels or frogs, as it's at least hypothesizable, for example, from the example of a specific relief that is preserved in London, the one of the Chamomile Street that we mentioned before, and the distinctive mantle of the higher ranks was instead the Paludamentum, right? A short cloth, actually, that was made up of a very refined tissue that the consul traditionally wore when he received the military imperium, right? So this was usually dyed in purple, so this very expensive dye at the time to which was associated this kind of aristocratic character in the empire in itself. And in imperial times, the paludamentum was adopted by the officers proper, but also by the centurions as a sign of distinction, right? The paludamentum was fixed by one extremity on the left side of the chest, then it was passed behind the shoulder, or in certain cases behind, on the back, and ultimately was kept over the left arm with this light drapery. And there are beautiful examples of it. For example, there is the paludamentum of the centurion Sertorius Festus from the Maffeian Museum of Verona that shows it pretty clearly. Passing to the aforementioned Focale, right? In many representations, we can see around the soldier's neck this sort of scarf of wool or linen known as Focale. In fact, after Martialis, 14137, also known in Greek as prosignathidion, that was probably used rather than just as an indiment proper, also to protect the neck from the contact with the armor, right? Both the mail or segmented one. And one of the two strips of the Focale was knotted at the height of the throat, and it was worn underneath the armor proper in order to make thickness. There are even in here several representations on Trajan column. This was worn by auxiliaries as well, right? So actually all of these clothing was worn by legionnaires and auxiliaries alike, and this also naturally speaks for the relative loosening, at least if there had been anything as signs of distinction. Now that these clothes were somewhat subordinated to by other logics that are not completely clear, but yeah, they're clothes, point. These were kind of universal types of clothing were worn by anyone, and many other peoples among the auxiliaries had already those kind of clothing, as we have seen. So once again, it's not properly a sign of distinction in terms of typology of troop, right? Then passing to the headgear, right? The most widespread one was the Pileus or Pilleus, right? It was a felt cap of Greek origin, also in this case, that in the case of the soldier constituted an ideal padding for the helmet, right? That is, we often say, before, I don't know, the 12th, 13th century, there's scarce evidence in military history of padded armor, but actually we have. It's not so radically widespread, even as a typology of evidence, for sure, right? But there are these things, and naturally certain problems were universal, historically speaking. So just basing ourselves on the, evidence of evidence, right? The presence of evidence, right? It's not the entire picture that we may not know, but still we should sort out why, for example, it wasn't such a great emphasis. And on this topic, actually, there is no universally nobody knows, but we can clearly see the functionality of such even normal clothing that could be used like armor, right? And it does work like one in general. And the Pileus shape was usually hemispheric or conical, right? And sometimes with the top essentially bent in towards the front, according to the Eastern fashion of so-called Phrygian cap, right? And among the Romans, that that the Phrygian cap at this point had even been imitated in helmets, etc. So it was definitely not difficult to imitate it, giving as a cap itself. And among the Romans, the felt cap was actually also an emblem of freedom, and for this reason, it was also usually worn by the liberti. Right? We know this from Livy 24:32. There are beautiful examples from coins. There is Pileus, symbol of freedom, in money struck by Brutus in 42 BC. Also here, like the Pileus is the symbol of republicanism, right, against Caesar's legacy and the Caesarians during the civil war. Then there were also other types. Obviously, this is just a categorization, but there were many other clothes that fundamentally we don't know much of, right? But there was also this type of hat that was worn normally also by civilians, and it was originary of Thessalia, famously Thessaly, the Petasus, right, that had iconically very broad rims, right, and it was generally circular in shape and was tied with a lanyard, neck yard under the chin. And it was usually a hat associated to the figure of the god Mercury, and it was used both by the agriculturists, the hunters, but also by the wayfarers, because it was very light, and with these broad rims, it could shelter you effectively from the sun. So it was very, very practical in many ways, and it was so popular. In fact, it was worn by the same Augustus, according to Suetonius, Augustus 82. And for this reason, Caligula also allowed the senators to wear it in the theater, right, according to Cassius Dio for the 59:7, and the Petasus could be in felt or in leather, right, but sometimes also in wicker, especially for summer, as we were saying before. Right, so that's pretty much it. We will address the rest of Roman clothing and more broadly of equipment in general with other videos, but this was probably one of the shortest ones I ever made, but still I think can be useful. So for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.